Hello there, very good evening to you. After a week we meet again, and today too we have a number of topics that we'll be discussing on the program, and in the studio is Dr. Danjatila with us. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, it has been an interesting week after all.
Yes, yes.
Highlight of the week being the Bond Commission and how Arjun Aloysius has been banned from travelling abroad, including his 4 other colleagues, who's a CEO of Perpetual Treasuries, Noel Salgoda, Sachinta Devatantri, and Kasun Palisena. Well, with this being the latest highlight, or the biggest highlight, I would say, do you think that the investigation is now expedited? Now it's we are almost there for a proper verdict to happen, or proper verdict to be given.
Well, Stephanie, I think that what you have is a neck-and-neck race. On the one hand, the Commission is proceeding with extraordinary transparency and professionalism to move to the next level of accountability.
Right.
I say this because the Prime Minister's name has come up twice in the last stretch. So it's kind of homing in some way on the responsibility. We don't know the extent of the responsibility, but the responsibility of the Prime Minister. Right. It is the PM's name came up on 2 occasions, separated by the recess of the Commission. The Commission restarted yesterday. Just before the recess, the Deputy Solicitor General Dapud
Dilivera, yes.
He asked Arjuna Mahendra whether it was or wasn't true that he was recruited for the job,
right,
on a telephone call to Singapore by Prime Minister Wickremesinghe.
And he wasn't even sworn in as the
yes,
official governor.
That comes down the line. So, Arjuna Mahendran says, well, I don't remember whether it was a telephone call, but yes, it was the Prime Minister who recruited me.
Right.
Now, bear in mind that Mr. Mahendran's lawyer said that the questions should be respectful because Mr. Mahendran is a citizen of Singapore. Bear also in mind that Singapore does not permit dual citizenship.
Right.
So, Mr. Mahendran was not even a dual citizen. He was a citizen of Singapore. We now know that the Prime Minister reached out to him and offered him the job, or persuaded him to take the job.
Right.
We also know that he used to travel on, he was given a diplomatic passport or some kind of papers which enabled him to come and go while not being a Sri Lankan citizen.
Right.
And as transpired yesterday, he had not even officially kind of sworn in as the head of the central bank.
But keeping that in mind, can you even prosecute an official when he was not even sworn in into his official position as the governor of the central bank? Is it even constitutional?
Well, Stephanie, there are 2 ways of looking at it. One is that, now let's take the famous Corby Chappell case. She's an Australian citizen, but she violated the law of Indonesia while in Bali, and she's in jail. So if you commit a crime, I mean, if somebody here who's a citizen of country X
right,
engages in child prostitution, and this sort of thing has happened, they're locked up. So that's one possible interpretation. But more interesting is this. Now the central bank, I mean, it's not to be a consultant, it's not some private sector organization. This is the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. Why would the Prime Minister reach out to Singapore and recruit a person who is not the most qualified, because Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy is certainly far more qualified.
Right. And he was in the country.
He was in the country. And he was on a short list.
Right.
Why would Arjun Mahendran, a non-Sri Lankan, be brought in from a country that does not even entertain dual citizenship, unlike, say, the United States of America, and made the head of the central bank, that's the apex body of our of the state's financial institutions, and lo and behold, shortly after that you have a process which Yasanta Kodagara of the AG's team has described in writing in response to Ramesh De Silva as the biggest financial fraud in the country's history, the consequences, the amount of which has not yet been calculated or is not yet calculable. Now that's on the record, that's not propaganda. And that's not being contested by Mr. Mahendran's lawyers. So we used to have to say, Mr. X, it's not Mr. X, it's a PM, reaches out, gets hold of Mahendran from Singapore, brings him in, puts him in charge of the central bank, and then coincidentally you have a terrible and huge scandal in which the said Mr. Mahendran's son-in-law is named. Far too many coincidences. Now I said it's a neck and neck race because while this is happening, you have something else happening, and that is an acceleration of a constitutional process, one of the targets of which is to get rid of the presidency. So I see the two things together. There is the Bond Scam Commission, which is very transparently moving towards a certain destination.
Doctor, I think we should kind of refresh our memory a little bit into remembering how exactly these appointments are made. Should it go through the cabinet when the Prime Minister picks an official to work in a very high position like the central bank? Should it go through the cabinet? Should there be an approval basis or a process that should take place prior to the...
Well, if you go through your archives here, you will come across two stories which don't contradict each other but which are sequential. One is that at the very beginning, when Mr. Mahendran was brought in, the President raised objections. So also another minister. But the President raised objections. The Prime Minister insisted and he was appointed. The second story that you will find in your archives is that when the President sought to remove him, the Prime Minister fought very hard to retain him.
Right.
And in fact, when his term ended and the President didn't renew the contract, he was made a consultant by the Prime Minister. And there was a lot of haggling which went on for weeks until finally the President appointed Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy.
And also, just before we go in for a break, just a teaser, there was also a lot of revelation that was that ended up taking place here in the Commission itself during the investigation and during the hearing itself. And former Governor of the Central Bank, Arjun Mahendran, had said that the minutes that were recorded of whether or not the Prime Minister had given instructions to stop direct placements was very quote-unquote sketchy. Well, we will go in deep, we'll analyze that deeply enough for us to really stretch the whole story onto the table, and we'll definitely go into that story after this short commercial break. Back, you're watching Vantage Point, and just before the break we spoke about how former Governor of the Central Bank Arjun Mahendran had said that the instructions that were given by Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe as to whether the direct placements should be stopped or not, and the minutes that was recorded in the Monetary Board meeting in 2015-17 was very sketchy. Even before that, the Cabinet didn't even know that the direct placements were stopped, and the Governor of the Central Bank at that time was given instructions to do so. Former Governor was right when he said it was sketchy. Even for him it was sketchy, and he mentioned that very word, sketchy, at the Presidential Commission of Inquiry, at the Bond Commission itself. So this lays out as to why exactly and how exactly this whole process had been taking place from the year 2015. Would you elaborate further on that?
Well, Stephanie, what do we have here? What we have here is not merely this strange set of coincidences that I laid out before, which is that there's a gentleman in Singapore when there are plenty of qualified, highly qualified people with central bank backgrounds. The Prime Minister reaches out to him, brings him in from Singapore. He's not a citizen, he can't get dual citizenship. He's placed at the apex of the central bank, and then coincidentally something terrible happens, and even more coincidentally it's the relative by marriage of Mr. Mahendran whose name comes up and his firm's name comes up. Now that's one thing. So if you stick to that story, you have the PM reaching out because he thinks he's the best guy, brings him over. It's a bit odd because we've not had a non-Sri Lankan as head of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka since 1956, when John Exeter was the last one, and he was removed by SWRD Bananaga. But with what you just spotlighted, we go beyond that to the actual intervention by the Prime Minister. I mean, you think that the Prime Minister has better things to do than give advice or suggestions about how bonds are issued. I mean, you know, this is a kind of a micro decision.
We see a lack of transparency in the whole process.
Well, we see the Prime Minister's name cropping up in the process.
Right in the initial stages.
Not just in bringing this gentleman over and putting him in charge. Now, Mr. Mahendran invokes the fact that he's not a citizen at this moment and says, you know, look out how you treat me. So one does wonder, you know, I mean, about the choice of Mr. Mahendran, why a non-Sri Lankan was recruited for this post. Is it precisely because at some point, if it goes wrong, the non-Sri Lankan can say, hey, I'm a non-Sri Lankan. There's a limit to what you can do. So one doesn't know. There's a reasonable doubt, if I may say so, to use the courtroom language. But now you have something more. You have the direct footprints. You have the Prime Minister intervening in a decision-making process. And saying, in a decision-making process pertaining to this whole scam, and saying, do this, don't do this. Now that's direct involvement.
Well, taking a look, knowing that there is a travel ban that was imposed on 4 of the main officials of the perpetual treasuries, we see that, just let us, can we speculate that this could be the last few stages of the hearing? Because usually a travel ban means...
Well, Stephanie, it depends on whether the Commission intends to net just a few medium-sized fish, or whether they are going to take it to its logical conclusion. Because now names have been named. And I would suppose that the PM has to be brought in and cross-questioned about all of this. In any other country, you know, in Southeast Asia, let alone in the West, which we seek to emulate, by now, people would have been on the streets demonstrating, or in any case, there would have been such pressure in Parliament, the PM would have resigned. I mean, whether it was South Korea or Japan or, you know, whatever, Thailand, anything of this sort, at this point, the social pressure and the political pressure mounts.
Well, switching topics now, what's really happening to the constitutional bill? We've been seeing progress. Have we been seeing progress, or is it just, are we going in reverse?
Well, as I hinted in what I was saying earlier, I think this is not unrelated to the issue of the bond scam and the Commission. Because if you just track it, on the one hand, you have an investigation in which the Prime Minister's name is cropped up. So one really doesn't know whether the next stage, which could be the final stage, in the last quarter of this year, is going to close in at that level on the PM. I mean, where does the buck stop? That's the question. Now, at the same time, you have an acceleration of the constitutional process where the centerpiece is that the president, the executive presidency should be abolished and power should be shifted to the PM. So it seems to me to be some kind of a cold war, a power struggle. You don't know which of these forces is going to cancel out the other. You don't know where this is going to hit. So I don't see these two as entirely separate or separable. It's too much of a coincidence that in one part of the frame you have an investigation which is naming the PM now, and in the other part of the frame you have UNP ministers saying we want to abolish the executive presidency and we have produced a position, an interim report which suggests that well, the parliament should select the president.
So are they confident that they will have the two-third majority backing them in this process?
Well, the arithmetic doesn't really work out, Stephanie, because as Dayasiri Jayasekara said on, I think, your station yesterday, at least I saw it on your station, he said in Sinhalese, I don't know why people are demonstrating on the street about a new constitution or against a new constitution. How can you have a new constitution without the vote of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party? That's 44 guys. And right now there is a fundamental difference of opinion between the UNP TNA on the one hand and the UNP JVP, also convergent on certain issues, the joint opposition at the other corner, and the Sri Lanka Freedom Party in the middle. So the Sri Lanka Freedom Party is not at this moment with the UNP, TNA or even the JVP on the issue of the constitution. I studied I studied the whole report carefully, and I went through the annexures, that is the position papers of the parties. Now the interim report is really the UNP position, because the UNP presents as draft of the report, the PM presented it. Then you have the TNA, the JO, the SLFP, the JVP, the JHU, and the SLMC, and together with the EPDP and so on, not insignificant minority parties. Now the way it breaks down is this. The UNP says we'll delete the term unitary from the constitution, including in the English version. Can you imagine? The English version of the constitution as proposed by the interim report does not use the English term unitary. Instead, the English version, I repeat, is supposed to have the terms Ekiya and Orumittanadu, neither of which are English language. So why on earth, this sounds like the Bond scam to me, why would you have the English translation of the constitution containing non-English words for something that defines the nature of the state? So that's one problem. The other problem seems to be that Ekiya, which is unitary, and Orumittanadu don't say the same thing. Orumittanadu, there's another word for Ekiya, for unitary, it's called Otriachi, which exists in the present constitution. Orumittanadu means an indivisible country that has come together. Now, I mean, if that's what you want to say, that's what you want to say, but then don't say something different in another language, and don't delete the English term, because that's the term that any court is going to look for. Because all the literature is in English. So, I mean, if you want to debate unitary versus federal, you have to have it in English, because you have whole football fields full of books on this subject. There's nothing on Orumittanadu and Ekiya. I mean, you can't fill this table with books in Sinhalese and Tamil on this subject. So, the JHU, which is a constituent member of the government, says no. you have to retain the unitary character. The Sri Lanka Freedom Party, which is a constituent member of the government, says no, you have to retain the unitary character. You have to retain the term unitary. The JVP says retain unitary. The JO, which is the opposition, says retain unitary. The TNA says go federal. So at the start, you have a problem within the government, never mind outside the government.
Doctor, primarily the constitutional bill was set to be tabled under just one reason. The reason being the constitutional bill being, the constitution being archaic, and then we need a new constitution, minority should be included. But now we see a new inclusion into it of how the executive presidency needs to be abolished, and prime minister needs to be given most of the powers. But we see a whole
That's
mix
another
of,
coincidence.
and is that the reason why the opposition, the governing UNP party is trying to push this forward? And is that the reason why they're trying to expedite the whole process?
Of course.
Interestingly enough, we need to go in for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about more on Vantage Point. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Vantage Point. Just before the break, Doctor, we spoke, interestingly enough, how primarily they wanted to change the constitution under one reason, the reason being the inclusion of the minority, and they had a lot of reasonable reasons for as to why they should be changing the archaic constitution.
But the SLFP says, let's fully implement the 13th Amendment. So the SLFP wants to address the issues of the minorities. The question is whether one should go beyond the 13th Amendment or not, because if you want to go beyond it, which is what the UNP and the TNA are suggesting, that the powers of the governor should be reduced and the governor should act on the advice of the Board of Ministers of the Provincial Council. Now that requires a referendum, and as you know, Stephanie, these days no government wins a referendum anywhere in the world.
And there's an election coming up in how many years? The big election.
The big one, the presidential in late 2019, the parliamentary in 2020.
So it's required of the government to change things fast. So I think that's the reason why there's so much of active presence of the UNP in changing the constitution.
Well, they're trying, but they may overshoot the mark and have to go for a referendum where all the frustrations of the people over economic issues might come to the surface, as in any other country.
Right. We've just got 4 minutes to wrap up this edition of Vantage Point, but before we wrap up, we need to speak about the Las Vegas mass shooting.
Yeah.
The number started increasing from 20, and
it's 50 something.
It's now 50. It could be even more than that, because there are about 200 of them injured already. This is in history of the US.
The worst.
The worst. Is it just, it cannot be deemed as a terrorist attack?
Well, the FBI says so far no connections, though ISIS has taken credit, but no connections as far as the FBI knows. And evidently the perpetrator's father was a violent robber who was in jail for violent armed robbery. So there's a bit of a history there.
Do you think this whole incident will bring back whether or not a US citizen should be given a firearm, whether the IRS should be...
Well, Stephanie, I mean, that's what it's all about. Now, I'm one who admires the US Constitution giving the citizen the right to bear arms, but surely there have to be stringent checks. It doesn't mean that the citizen's right to bear arms is translated into the current situation where you without any check about your mental background, you go buy a gun which is an automatic, which is locked as a semi-automatic. You take it to your garage, you fiddle around with it, and you convert it to an automatic rifle. And this guy had 10 rifles. That's why you heard the fire. It was like a heavy machine gun.
Why haven't they established this screening process as yet?
That's the US Congress. The gun lobby has a lot of money, and the congressmen really don't care. What they care about is the money that comes in for their campaigns. Most of them are Republican, I must say. It's the right wing because it goes with their ideology. And they are blocking gun control. How many massacres have taken place in the United States, Stephanie? Whether they are terrorist related or not, they get the guns. They don't come in with the guns. They buy the guns in the United States.
Right.
And okay, I mean, it's democratic for every citizen to have the right to bear arms, but there have to be stringent checks. How can this kook, basically, with this background, get these weapons, 10 rifles,
Right.
and just keep shooting? I mean, you can't stop people from having criminal tendencies or going crazy or something, but you can certainly stop them from being able to buy guns over the counter.
Well, switching topics as quick as we can before we wrap up. Catalonia tried its luck for the second time. Do you think it will be declared or given permission by the Spanish government to...
Well, Stephanie was ambassador to Spain, and that included a lot of time in Barcelona. Let me tell you, there's no violent solution to this. You can't box them in. Spain will have to convert itself into some kind of loose federation or confederation, and that, even that might not work. There's very strong sentiment in Catalonia. It's been there for decades. So the problem, and this is where we have to take note, Iraqi Kurdistan 92%, Catalonia 90%. Both those places, there's no executive president. Is a parliamentary system, and Iraq is a federal system, and Spain does not define itself as unitary. It calls itself an indivisible, it's an Orubitanadu. So when you have the presence of when you have a federal or quasi-federal system and you don't have an executive president, if you have an executive president, it's safer. But if you have those two together, and that's what's in our interim report, then nothing can stop these referenda, and any ethnic group that sees itself as a nation heading for the exits.
Well, we are looking forward for an update on that, and by next week or week after we'll be able to extensively discuss about that topic. Well, we've come to the end of the show right now. Thank you very much for watching us. Remember, you can send us your opinions, your views, your questions to newsfirst@maharaja.lk. This place is always open for your questions and your views. This is Vantage Point, and we will see you next fortnight. Good night.